You know, whether you're building a deck, building a cabinet, or some other project, straight cuts can determine the success or failure of your project. And it all starts with a circular saw. You can use a circular saw. Here's how. I'm Eddie Field with Field Guide to DIY. We got a lot to cover. Let's dive in. Now, you may hear some folks call a circular saw a skill saw. Skill makes a circular saw, but the skill also makes table saws and drill presses and a host of other tools. So if you hear somebody calling it a skill saw, just keep in mind, it's really a circular saw. When you're shopping for a circular saw, there are a few things you want to keep in mind, like the weight, the portability of it. This old Miller Falls is about twice the weight of this Ryobi. Another thing you might want to consider is the blade direction. That is, where the blade sits in relation to the handle. Blade right, blade left. Personally, after years of working with a blade right, I never thought I would grow accustomed to a blade left. But a blade left comes in a lot handier because I'm right-handed with rip cuts. We'll get into that in a little bit. And also, with cross cuts, which we're also going to get into, I'm growing accustomed to having the blade left of the handle. I never thought I would, so keep that in mind. So in addition to the weight and the blade position, you got to ask yourself, do I want it corded or cordless? With a cordless, you have the convenience of just slapping in a battery pack, that's fully charged of course, and you're good to go. No cord to work around or risk possibly cutting through or wearing out over time. And circular saws come in blades of different sizes. There are some big beastie circular saws out there that are designed to cutting through really big stock. This blade is 6.5 inches in diameter. In addition, different saws will have different accessories. Now this saw has an attachment that lets you do rip cuts with a fence that you can slide right in here. And you want to be mindful of the safety of the saw. Like, for example, this blade guard can easily be grabbed and pulled up as I'm making my cut. This old Miller Falls, it might be a little harder for me to navigate without looking. So if you don't have it already, you want to install the blade. Even though the circular saw blade is not spinning, it's still sharp. So be mindful of the sharpness of that blade while you're installing it. For this model, I slide the blade guard out of the way, and I can just slide in the blade up from the bottom and place it on the arbor. Put on my keyed washer and the arbor bolt. This guy's reverse threaded. Always make sure your blade is tight before you operate it. Now with the blade installed, slap in the power. Now we're ready to cut. Now the cut of the circular saw blade on the wood is called the curf. I'm a big fan of curf marks. Curf marks are those big sweeping circles that came off the mill back in the old days. And you can still find some antique pieces with some curf marks. Love me some curf marks. But my love for curf marks will just help remind you that that's the amount of wood that's being taken out of your cut. So this is an 1/8 of an inch blade, so it takes out an 1/8 of an inch of whatever I'm cutting. And also, when I'm making my cut, I need to keep in mind where I want my cut and my waste. Because if it's going to take out an 1/8 of an inch, and I want a piece of wood that's exactly 24 inches long, I need to keep my cut outside of that 24 inches. Also, you'll notice that there's some blade guides on the front of the circular saw. If you're going to use those guides, you need to know where those guides are in relation to where the blade is cutting. Now to make a straight rip cut, you may want to use a blade guard like this, or I've seen folks clamp a piece of wood or a level. For cross cutting, I've seen folks use a regular framing square as their guide and run their fence along that square. If I'm cutting along the length of the piece of wood, that's a rip cut. So if you hear somebody say, rip me off a 2-inch piece, they're talking about long ways. Now most of the time, as you're getting more and more accustomed to working with a circular saw, you may not need to use a guide. But if you're just starting out, you may need to use a straight edge to help you make those cuts straight. So let's say we need to take off an inch off of this board. If you're just getting started out, you may want to use a clamp to help you hold that piece of wood while you make that cut. Now if I'm cutting across the long run of a piece of wood, that's a cross cut. Again, you want to see where the blade cut is going to fall in relation to your measurement. So I'm actually going to make my measurement, and I'm going to look down to see where the blade is in relation to that line. So this saw says 0 is right there at that mark, and it looks pretty accurate. Also, when I'm making big cuts out of big 4x8 sheets of plywood, I tend to use a pair of sawhorses, a big scrap piece of 4x8 sheet as a workbench, and then I'll put down some insulation foam that is a 4x8 sheet, something that I'm not afraid of it being cut through. I'll set my blade depth and I'll make my cut. Also, don't be afraid to stop, let the saw blade wind down with it still in the wood. Reposition if you need to, and continue your cut. Pick up where you left off. It's known as a kickback, where the blade binds within the material. So I like to work at a controlled angle where I have control over the circular saw. You also want to set your blade at the appropriate depth. So if you're working with a 3/4 inch piece of wood, you don't want an insane amount of blade sticking out. I like to have just between 1/8 and 1/4 inch sticking out. That is, sticking below the wood. So I can just adjust this blade and put it right about there and tighten it down. But I always need to be mindful and aware of where that blade is. So if you're making your cut, you don't want to hold the wood with your fingers in the path of the blade. It may sound like common sense, but there are a few folks out there who are named Lefty for a reason. Also, when I'm working with wood or any other material, I like to protect my hearing and I like to protect my lungs. Especially with plywood, you don't know what sort of chemicals are actually in those laminates. Keeping all these factors in mind, let me know in the comments below what project you're using your circular saw for. I'll see you in the next video.